Hello, everybody. It is Saturday night at 9 o'clock Eastern Time and 8 o'clock Central Time. I am Chris Weuve. This is Starfleet Tactical, and I'm here with Chris Carlson. Hello, Chris. How are you?
Doing well, sir. And you? I see you've got some movement back there.
I got a little movement. Now we're not going to do a show next week because next week, today, people from IKEA brought me 13 pieces of furniture in 22 boxes. Next week, one guy is going to come and assemble those 13 pieces of furniture. I suspect I'll probably end up helping him. And I have no idea how long that's going to take. And I'm going to spend the day moving stuff around. So I'm not going to do a show next week. But the week after, when I do a show, those bookcases will be gone and there'll be new bookcases there and probably even some books on them. So that's the plan. That's the plan. And then at some point, I'll finish setting up lamps and stuff like that. So I'm hoping to have this place actually kind of looking like it's a usable office and turning it into a usable office in the near future. So, but it's coming along. It's coming along. Didn't get a chance to do much work on it this week because I was at a professional conference. I was at the Connections U.S. Professional Wargaming Conference. Some of you know that I do another conference called Connections Online, which is part of the Connections family of conferences. But mine is online only. The other one is in person only. And so I got to spend 3 days at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab at that conference, and that was a good time. Good time was had by all. Good time was had by all. So, but you were, as I mentioned earlier, Chris, we talked about you. You could, I'm sure you felt your ears burning. Some people commented that if you want unclassified data ready at hand, a good place to go is the Harpoon Wargame, and because it's all been vetted and it's all consistent. All the units are the same and you can compare apples to apples. And so it's a really good war game source, and it's a really good source to just be able to say this is what the current state of the art is on the Frats 5000, for instance. And so that was pretty good. So got back from that, saw a bunch of people, got back from that, turned around the next day and went to work. So
and saw many of the same people.
I did see a bunch of the same people. In fact, at one point, somebody from my employer, my new employer, I was in their talk, and the person looked around the room and said, "Why are there so many people from the job here?" And I said, I'm new. I haven't seen this yet. But we had 6 people there, including me. So something like that. So I'm following my usual policy of not really talking about my current employer. That's just something I got into. And so, like, for instance, when I first started doing stuff online, I did not talk about the fact that I worked at DIA, but now I freely mention the fact that I used to work at DIA. Then I went and worked after DIA. I went and worked for a place that is still redacted. But in October, I will tell you where I worked, because my official last day at that job is September 30th, and then I will have retired from federal service. So I guess I just let it out of the bag. I work for the federal government, but I'll tell you what part of the federal government then.
Well, you have been working for the federal government for a while, sir.
I have. So I hit 20 years on 21 March. And so that's why I decided it was time to get out. So I did. But we're about to talk about aircraft carriers and battleships and stuff like that. And but I did want to say that I've been reading some other things that are probably going to show up in future episodes. I think I mentioned previously that I'm reading a dissertation on the development of British and American battle cruiser doctrine and designs. So it's basically what the Brits and the Americans were doing circa 1910 about battle cruisers, and it's very interesting. It's been slow going. Not that it's not an interesting paper that makes me want to read it. It's that the footnotes are so fascinating that I'm about 150 pages into this dissertation, and I've read at least 150 pages of footnoted documents too. So I've been reading a lot of that stuff. And then I'm getting ready to read Brian Clark's stuff from about 10 years ago, where he proposed that basically the U.S. Navy should, in its surface force, should rethink the type of missiles that it carries. Do you remember these documents?
Yeah. It's interesting because what he's really getting at is that even with Aegis, when you shoot at really long range, there's a delay time.
Yeah, and it's
for the next salvo. And what he's getting at is range really worth it in terms of engagement opportunities?
So basically, what he's suggesting in this is that rather than have lots of long range missiles, that we should decide to intercept stuff at a shorter range, because the shorter range missiles are so much smaller. One of the reasons is the shorter range missiles are so much smaller that you can put 4 of them in a VLS cell that you could only put 1 long range missile in. And so you could keep the number of defensive missiles the same, and now you've got some empty cells that you can fill with offensive missiles. And part of his argument is that you're really limited in terms of if your doctrine is shoot, look, shoot, or shoot, shoot, look, shoot, shoot, or something like that. If you're always constantly having to wait for it to cycle through, you don't get as many salvos and you don't have as many opportunities to take down the bad guy. And also the fact that the missile ranges are getting longer, and so it's getting harder and harder to reach out and shoot the archer before he fires. And so, shooting the archer is the idea that you'd want to hit the airplane before it launches. And so it's getting harder and harder to do that. And so maybe, just maybe, we should give up on that, and instead we should try to intercept stuff as it gets closer. So it's an interesting idea, and I read this stuff about 6 years ago, maybe, and I decided it was time to go reread it. And this leads to, there's some interesting things that we could talk about on the show at some point. So Chris, maybe you can come back for that. Because most science fiction, I'm really interested in science fiction that thinks in terms of things like, how should I equip my ships for range? Should I equip for long range? Should I equip for short range, et cetera, et cetera? You never hear that conversation in Star Trek. You rarely hear it in anything else. The real big exception that I can think of off the top of my head is, wait for it, the Honor Harrington series.
Yep. It's the only one that I can think of.
Yeah, I'm having a hard time thinking of,
It doesn't exist in Babylon 5. Really doesn't exist in Star Wars. Well, maybe.
Don't even bother including Star Wars.
Yeah,
that way madness.
Maybe the Battlestar Galactica reboot, because their offensive stuff, you start getting concepts of range, but it's vague.
I'm sorry, which property?
The Battlestar Galactica.
Yeah,
they're long range offensive weapons. The stuff that, instead of Vipers taking out base stars, it's actually a Battlestar that's got to do it.
Yeah, Bob points out that there's an issue with how fast you can salvo from a VLS due to the shared exhaust port for multiple VLS cells. There's also potentially some other issues there, including like, is the missile that they talked about using Evolved Sea Sparrow, is that the right missile? For a lot of that stuff, I kind of look at it and say, okay, you might have some technical issues with the exact gear that we have now. It's really more, as much as anything, it's like, well, you might have to modify the system in order to make it work. If nothing else, you're probably going to modify, you're going to put dividers in the cells in order to have, so that each of the missiles have their own little thing. Andromeda is actually, so Stephen Ross says, what about Andromeda? Andromeda is actually a pretty, Andromeda is probably second behind Babylon 5. I'm sorry, not Babylon 5. Honor Harrington in that regard. Andromeda is surprisingly sophisticated about certain things, and that's I attribute to the fact that they had a retired surface warfare officer on staff for the first season, and you can see his fingerprints all over that stuff. I'd love to meet the guy. And especially you can see that when you go to the website that's now being hosted by saveandromeda.com, if I remember correctly, that has the All Systems University. They did it in conjunction with the show. And that has just some fantastic stuff in it. It's got a list of the canonical missions of the High Guard, right? So we actually know what their mission statement is. We have a list of their missions. And we also have ratings on what the utility of each ship is in doing that mission. So in other words, they gave us all the missions and they gave us the counter values to put on the counters when we designed the game, which I thought was really pretty nice of them. So thank you, Andromeda people, for doing that. So tonight, anything else before we sort of skip to the slides I put together?
No, I think we should get straight to it.
Okay, so I've been reading a couple of books, and that's what sort of led to this. But I think, yeah, let's do the admin stuff, and then I'll sort of talk about the books I've been reading and things like that. So admin-wise, so today we're doing a show. Yay, 2nd August, let's do a show. Next week, no, we're not going to do a show, and that's because I'm doing IKEA stuff, and I just don't know when I'm going to be done, and I don't know. It's entirely possible I'm going to spend 10 hours, doing physical activity and won't feel like doing a show. So I just decided to make a virtue out of necessity, not do a show. Still don't know about 23 August. 16 August, we should be good. Don't know about 23 August. I'm trying to remember now off the top of my head what was the potential thing for 23 August, but I will get this all figured out by the time of the next show. And so as always, I'm not expressing the opinion of any employer, past or present, and all the images involved that I've borrowed for educational purposes and to offer critiques. They are not intended as copyright infringement on anybody. Most of the stuff came from Wikipedia, but there's some stuff that didn't. So, they're all good pieces of art, and good photos, and I would suggest that people should treat them accordingly. So, but I've been reading some books, and I decided that it was all sort of churning around in my head, and I decided it was worth trying to sort of pull things together. I talked about this topic with Alec Peters in episode 158, which was way back in January. But it was only a couple of slides worth, but I talked about a little bit about carriers versus battleships and whether I thought fighters, carriers and fighters made sense in Star Trek. But since then, I've read Lars Celander's How Carriers Fought, which is about World War II carrier operations, and it's a really seriously good book. I enjoyed it a lot. And I also, yep, that's it. And it's a great book, and it's got lots of nitty-gritty details, and it's also got, he's able to do both the big picture and the little picture, which is a nice touch. Like, one of the things he talks about is the Japanese had crappy radios. It's not that Japanese had crappy engineering or crappy science. What they had was crappy manufacturing. And so as a result of that, they weren't able to do some of the stuff that we were able to do. And one of them was to make a decent radio for the Zero. And so a lot of the Zeros had such crappy radios, a lot of pilots actually pulled the radios out because they didn't think they were worth the wait. And so as a result of that, when the Japanese are doing carrier combat air patrol, when they've got cap stations above the carrier, there's no way for the guys on the carrier who, at least late in the war, actually did have radar to be able to tell the cap where the threat is. And so they would do stuff like fire their guns in the direction of the incoming raid. And the pilots would say, oh, there are splashes in the water in that direction, so there must be a raid coming from that direction. Whereas we were giving them specific bearings and, to some degree, altitude information. I say to some degree altitude information is because they generally didn't have a height-finding radar. And they were playing games with things like, we know that the side lobes had X attributes and would detect stuff within, they could tell based upon some of the things that were going on with the side lobes in general what the altitude was. The Brits radar was actually better about giving them that sort of incidental information than the US radar was. And so it's got a lot of interesting little tidbits on that stuff. And he talks a little bit at the end about the proximity fuse, and he talks about how the 5-inch 38 dual purpose guns were really designed to shoot at heavy bombers that were going to be doing level bombing against battleships, which it turned out had like no utility whatsoever. That just didn't work. So then I started reading Battleship Commander, which is about Vice Admiral Willis Lee. Lee, of course, was the commander at, I can never keep it straight. Is it first or second Guadalcanal?
First. Second, excuse me, second.
Okay.
Because he's on Washington.
Yeah, he's on Washington. And so it's the battle that I always colloquially refer to as Washington versus Hiroshima versus South Dakota, because that describes who shot at who. Although Hiroshima actually did fire at Washington. I didn't realize that. Hiroshima fired at Washington and the shots went high. They could hear them whistling overhead. And so you get into a lot of stuff on battleship ops in that book. And so when I sort of threw in some, thinking from Wayne Hughes's Fleet Tactics, and I forgot to include it here, but Ivan Musicant's Battleship at War, which is a biography of ship history of the Washington, and so it covers a lot of the same stuff as Battleship Commander does. So I can't really say that I've done anything that I would consider to be actual analysis on this. I haven't used any formal techniques. I haven't even really written a whole lot down. A lot of it is just me sort of going like, yeah, it seems to me to make sense that X is true. Analysis doesn't have to be quantitative, but in this particular case, this is a quantitative type problem, and I have not done quantitative analysis on it. So everybody should just keep that in mind. This is the beginning of a discussion, and this is basically just what I came up with. The slides are mine. Chris and I have talked about it a little bit. We haven't had a chance to sort of go through the slides together, though. So that's kind of where we're at. I think if we start a conversation and identify some questions for further study, that'd be great. I'm fully expecting that I'm going to come back to this topic. Because it's an interesting topic, and it's one that I want to build into some of my more formal presentations that I do at science fiction conventions. And so you guys frequently see that stuff first. Okay, let me go to the next one. Okay, so wait a minute. I'm missing a slide. Okay, there's supposed to be an agenda slide there, or did I do that already? Oh yeah. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm not remembering the order. Okay, so this is what we're going to go through. Caveats I just did. Why did real world carriers replace, and I have that in quote, battleships? And then we're going to talk about Star Trek and Battlestar Galactica. Okay, so this is sort of basically the big overview of why did real world carriers replace battleships. First of all, let's ask the question, did they actually do that? And then got some stuff on offensive capabilities and defensive capabilities, and talk about ship killers a little bit, and a little bit about scouting and what I'm calling range of influence or range of action, which is, I think, is the right way to think about this. Okay, so I would argue, and I didn't really articulate it well in this slide. I should have put it that the missions of the battleship changed. The battleships were still pretty busy during the war, doing basically three things. One was the fast battleships were protecting the fast carriers. The fast and slow battleships were prepared to do shore bombardment, and the fast and slow battleships were prepared to fight a surface action, most likely at night, if called upon to do that. We stopped building battleships because we had a clear superiority in battleships, and there wasn't any reason to make that superiority even more so. So it wasn't that battleships weren't useful. All the battleships were fully engaged. There was a time period after Pearl Harbor where we had to rebuild a bunch of them. There was a time period after Pearl Harbor where we were sort of fuel limited, and we didn't spend a whole lot of time tooling the battleships around because we wanted to use the fuel for the carriers. But by the end of the war, all the battleships were fully and completely engaged in fighting. So, Chris, any thoughts on that? You want to fight me on that?
I think when you say that we had, clearly had superior battleships, that is a true statement. But what I would point out is that we had two more Iowas well along. Hulls were completed. They just needed to have stuff stacked into it. But it was becoming obvious that large carriers is what did the fighting.
Yeah.
And we were building the midways.
Yeah.
So the Iowas and the Montanas got cacked because the handwriting was on the wall. Long range attacks by aircraft was dominating, 1943, 44, 45. You had the odd surface action.
Yeah, that's true. I think though that if we didn't have the Iowas, we probably would have built them, right? If we only had the Iowas and we did not have the South Dakotas and the North Carolinas, I think there's a good chance we would have built those last two Iowas.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the Montanas too, for that matter. Although the big problem with the Montanas is that the Montanas were not going to run around with the aircraft carriers. They weren't fast enough to do that, I don't think.
Yeah, and I think they weren't Panama Canal capable either.
No, they weren't. Now, a lot of people make a big deal over them not being Panamax, but and that is a big deal. But they make it usually gets phrased in terms of, we decided to just ignore that because we wanted to build this really big ship. That actually isn't what happened. There was a plan to either widen the existing locks or put in new locks into the Panama Canal. And the Montana was built to fit the new locks. But like you always run into in a case where everything is taking multiple years to execute on, and you've got multiple plans that are coming together, sometimes a change in one plan means that another piece over here is no longer viable in the same way. And so they just decided that, hey, the Panama Canal is good enough, and that would require a lot of effort. We could use the effort to do other stuff, so we're just not going to do it.
And the improvement in offensive capabilities on the Montanas really wasn't worth the effort.
No, I would agree with that, because by this point in the war, the purpose of the battleships was to, the newer battleships, the purpose was to escort carriers and to protect them at night, and to be a hedge against the Japanese battleships coming out and bushwhacking them, especially at night. And so that's one of the things I think is really important to remember, is that we didn't decommission these battleships, right? We didn't just sort of say like, hey, you know, they've got huge crews, we could better use those crews manning aircraft carriers. No, they kept them. They saw a need for them because they were afraid of fighting a night action. And so it was useful to have them. They just didn't need to build any more because they had enough. And the Japanese Navy is decreasing in size. The Japanese battle line is decreasing in size, and the U.S. battle line had been increasing in size. So early on in the war, the U.S. had an incentive to not fight a surface action. And we only did it at Guadalcanal because we needed Guadalcanal, and it was the only way to keep Guadalcanal. So we had to go fight a surface action. We didn't want to fight it because we knew that we were building battleships, and eventually the pendulum was going to swing in our direction. The Japanese wanted to fight it early because they knew that we were building a bunch of battleships, and eventually the pendulum was going to swing in our direction. By the time we were sort of even up, we didn't want to fight it as an even up battle, because why would you fight an even up battle when you can just wait and outmass the other guy later on, right? You know, we're getting stronger, they're not getting stronger, and so let's wait until we're stronger. And then later on, we wanted to fight that battle, and the Japanese were less interested in fighting that battle because they were outgunned. So at least that's kind of how I see it.
No, that's about right, because the only really modern ships they had were Yamato and Musashi. Everything else had been built towards the end or soon after World War I and upgraded.
Yeah.
You know, and they lost Mutsu to a magazine explosion in harbor. So, you know, they had Nagato was the only one that could really, you know, pony up to the bar with any of our fast battleships with the 16-inch guns. Everybody else was a little bit smaller than that.
Yeah.
But
you know, now that having been said, if you're fighting a night action, I don't think that matters as much.
It doesn't matter as much, but radar does matter.
Radar does matter.
And
in fact, there's who was it that wrote that Naval Institute Proceedings article? Was it Norman? You know, the one I'm talking about, the what would happen if there was a solo duel between an Iowa and a Yamato?
I don't remember if it was Norm Friedman or not.
It might have been Polmar, actually. It might have been the other Norman.
Yeah.
Or it was one of the usual suspects. I can't remember which one. And it was a professional note in U.S. Naval Institute Proceedings. And the conclusion, there was perhaps a little bit of being a homer for the home team. But the conclusion was you'd rather be on the Iowa. And it basically boiled down to a couple of factors. The minor factor was the 16-inch 50 is a particularly hot gun. The 18-inch guns on the Yamato kind of underperformed. And so the difference between 16 inches and 18 inches is nowhere near as big as you think it is. So gun-wise, it's kind of even up. But we had way better radar than they did.
And we could also jam their radars.
Yeah, I don't think whoever it was talked about
it. They did not talk about that, but the TDY-1 was out, and that was specifically designed to go after the Japanese surface search. I believe that was the Type 2 Mod 2 that was used to feed gunfire. And we were just going to jam the living doll rags out of it. We had put it on battleships and cruisers.
That would be cool. So that would be even better. They can't hit us and we can hit them. We had and our radar was better anyway. We had targeting quality data because we are at a higher frequency and we could actually have targeting quality data at that point. So you could shoot off of ours, whereas now they had night optics. If we were fighting at night, that would help a little bit on their side, but hopefully we're scoring hits before they get close enough that the night optics even matter.
Well, the later radars, like 1944 and on, they were blind fire, where the angular resolution of the radar was about as good as visual. See, that was the downside of the first generation fire control radars. Their beam widths were a little bit sloppy. So we had great range, but not great bearing. And that's why the preference was to tell people where to look, get a visual bearing firing with radar information for range. Later on, we got both out of a radar, and that was a real tipping point.
Yeah. So as should be obvious, Chris is way more in the weeds on the details of the particular technical systems, et cetera. He spends a lot more time looking at archival data than I do. Usually if I've looked at something that came from the archives, it's because Chris sent it to me. So so he's much more up to speed on that stuff than I am. So in any event, that's sort of where we are in the question of did carriers replace battleships. So this is about offensive capabilities. And so I've shown you this chart before. It comes from Alan Washburn at the Naval Postgraduate School. And what he does is he converts the fire of various platforms into 8-inch round equivalents, and then adds in the rate of fire to sort of normalize it to something where you can compare apples to apples. And he gives you this chart of 8-inch rounds per minute, equivalent 8-inch rounds per minute, basically. And so you've got the number of equivalent 8-inch rounds per minute on the y-axis, and on the x-axis you have the range. And so as you can see there, there's a line for New Jersey that shows you that if you're up close within 10 miles, it can shoot you with 5-inch guns and 16-inch guns. If you go beyond 10 miles, there's a step down because the 5-inch guns can't reach you anymore, but the 16-inch guns can still reach you. And if you go beyond 24 miles, basically it no longer has a weapon that can touch you. And so up close, a battleship does way more, throws way more firepower than anything else up to and including aircraft carriers. What an aircraft carrier can do is hit you at 300 nautical miles, which a battleship can't do. And so this, incidentally, what we're looking at is the reason why the Reagan administration wanted to bring back battleships, and why the Marines have always wanted to have a battleship available to do gunfire support ashore. Because if you're within 24 nautical miles, you want to have a battleship. So I say there that the issue is range, not destructive capability. Now, Chris points out that battleships do not fire torpedoes out of those 16-inch guns to hit with a torpedo, which is as close to a one-shot, one-kill weapon as you can get. To hit with a torpedo, you need an airplane. Or, you need to be really close with a destroyer, but for all practical purposes, you need an airplane to do that. And that's true. And there's other sort of specialty cases here. But I would argue the big thing that makes the carrier so powerful as an offensive system is the fact that it can reach out and touch you at 300 nautical miles. It's not the amount of damage it can do. It's the fact that it can do that damage so far away, that it actually does less damage. There's the other reasons why there's asterisks there is because, you can more precisely, in theory, a dive bomber that's dropping on a target is able to place that weapon more precisely than a gunner who's 20 miles away shooting 16-inch shells. That gunner is, the battleship is firing multiple salvos over a longer period of time, so it's got more opportunities to hit. And in addition to that, there's somebody shooting back at that dive bomber, trying to convince him that he's making a poor life choice by continuing that attack. And you don't have that with shells, right? Dive bombers get shot down. To the best of my knowledge, there are no recorded instances of a 16-inch shell getting shot down. So, any thoughts on that, Chris?
I would, first of all, though, on the issue of range, you got to dial it in. I think you say, 20 miles?
Yeah, 24 is what's on the chart, but yeah.
Yeah, but what was the longest engagement in World War II with a gun?
I believe the answer is that a British ship got a hit at like 26 miles.
No, 26,000 yards.
Oh, you're right. It was
13 miles.
It was 26,000 yards. Yeah.
And there's possibly Yamato hit, Taffy 3 at 30. Possibly.
Yeah.
But the bottom line is that, and at that 15, let's call it 15 nautical miles just to be generous, the probability of hit of a 16-inch gun salvo is about a tenth of what a dive bomber could do.
Yeah, but you're firing 9 rounds.
Yeah, hoping one hits.
Yeah. And then you do it again, and you do it like 3 times per minute.
Yeah, but, so, okay, I'm doing all those shots. How many dive bombers in a squadron? How many salvos do we need to make with a battleship at its maximum range where it's really starting to lay out an advantage, if you will, for destructive power? Because at long range, it's kind of moot, to be honest with you. Now, when you get in closer, say like 20,000 yards, now your conversation ramps up. The battleship gunnery starts really getting better, particularly with radar.
Yeah, and the structure of, for lack of a better term, the structure of the engagement looks a lot different, and I talk about that on one of the upcoming slides. Aircraft carriers are very pulse, right? A bunch of planes come in and do their attack, and then some amount of time, maybe hours later, another bunch of planes comes in and does an attack. Whereas battleship engagements have this tendency that they sort of move towards each other, and once they get within range, you have an engagement that lasts until the engagement stops, right? And so you're multiple salvos per minute for an extended period of time, as opposed to like it all happens real quick and then it's done. Mm-hmm. So it's, I think the big picture takeaway that I'm trying to get across here is the idea that what makes a carrier special isn't really the amount of destruction it can do. It's the fact that it can do it at a really long range. Mm-hmm. I later on offer, I'll go ahead and do a prelim of this. I later on offer the idea that like if you didn't have the scouting ability of the airplanes to go find you your target, you still had to find the target through surface capabilities, and then you'd launch an airstrike against it. Like if the carrier had to actually see the target before it could launch, you wouldn't use aircraft carriers. You'd use battleships because they're better in that environment. We'll get to that. Okay, defensive capabilities real quick. Ton for ton, battleships are tougher. They got armor. They're just tougher. Airplanes can be shot down. Shells can't be, really. Aircraft carriers are inherently limited by huge amounts of 200 octane gasoline. Carriers burn really, really nicely when you hit the fuel tanks. And the difficulty of armoring the flight decks. Now, yes, Chris, but the Brits did it. Yeah, and the Brits, when they armored the flight decks, that had tremendous advantages. I mean, the comment was about when the Brits showed up in the Pacific and had to deal with kamikazes. A U.S. carrier ends up having to go back for a month or two worth of repairs, whereas on a British ship, all they said was "sweepers, man your brooms," and they just sort of brush it off. That's a little bit of an exaggeration, but not too much of one. But the problem is you pay a heavy penalty for that. You've got a very, very heavy piece, a very heavy weight high in the ship, which has a tendency to make it unstable, which means you've got that sort of permeates the warship design, the entire design process. Chris can actually talk about things like metacentric height and all that other stuff way better than I can. So aviation, I would argue, can be more precise, as Chris points out, but the pulse nature of carrier combat kind of negates some of that precision. Like if you take into you launch all your planes at a carrier at a target, and it goes and hits the target, and then the planes have to come back and rearm and reload and then refuel and then go back and do it again. When you start counting in the time it takes to move the planes back and forth, I'm not sure that carrier warfare is faster in terms of like how long does it take to sink a ship, or it's not as obvious as it at first seems to be if you take into account that you might have to launch multiple strikes. So feel free to throw big rocks at that.
No, you really can't argue with it. I mean, yeah, the Brits had armored flight decks, and that was helpful as long as an armor-piercing bomb was not used. Yes. If they got hit by one of those, they went back for many months.
Yeah, because our flight decks were made out of wood, and you put a hole in a wooden flight deck, they can fix that with what they've got on board.
Mm-hmm.
You put a hole like that in an armored flight deck, that requires a hardcore, heavy machine shop. At a minimum, right? You're cutting away metal, you're welding metal, big cranes, all the rest of it.
And that weight that the Brits are willing to pay came at a high cost with limited air groups. So their offensive capabilities were really cut down because they put so much weight into the armor. So for a carrier, armor's not that great, but the point is that when a battleship is designed, what's the design criteria? That it can resist fire from its own guns. Aircraft carriers have to be able to prevent other aircraft from attacking it, and then it relies on its fighters to do that.
Yeah, I mean, that resist fire from its own guns was a U.S. rule of thumb.
It was a Brit too. The Royal Navy did it.
But it's a rule of thumb, right?
Yes, it is.
There's no. It's not like the police are going to come and arrest you if you don't do that. Mm-hmm. I've heard people make the argument, well, the Iowas couldn't resist fire from their own guns at whatever arbitrary range theoretically that rule takes place at. And so therefore they're not really battleships, they're really battle cruisers. Well, okay, it's a rule of thumb. And when the ship was designed, it could meet the standard. And then they improved the ammunition for the gun.
And also the standard was not point blank, was not fire under 10,000 yards.
Yeah.
Okay, they were thinking of standard engagements, 15 to 20,000 yards. When the Iowa armor could defeat itself.
Yeah, especially with the old shells. So before they invented the super heavy shell.
Yeah, to weigh that, you have to look at the whole concept of the immunity zone.
Yes, which is probably not something for us to get into tonight.
No.
But it is also another concept that I think would be interesting if you put it in a science fiction context, and which I've never seen in a science fiction context, right? As a general rule, you never see, even in stories that are about ship design, which there's a lot of geeks like us out there, and frequently you'll see things where like, oh, we just built this new ship, or we're in the process of building this new ship and it's going to be so much better. They never really get into anything that looks like a metric like that, right? You never see anything that looks like the analysis about why they did it. It's usually just, I want more, bigger, faster, etc. So, okay, I'm going to move on. Okay, so ship killers, torpedoes, bombs, and shells can all be single-shot ship killers. Torpedoes are usually more likely to be, and it helps. It helps with armor-piercing bombs in that you can sort of put it where you want to put it. And armor-piercing bombs are really pretty good about being, mission kills at the very least. Now, I say insert Battlestar Galactica rant here. I'm specifically talking about the earlier Battlestar Galactica. Star Wars sort of fits into this too, but I don't analyze Star Wars. When I see what happened in the original Battlestar Galactica, where they're just sort of like, where you're having capital ships destroyed by fighters that are basically pew-pewing them to death. This is the equivalent of the fighters on an aircraft carrier sinking another ship by firing 50 cals at it. It doesn't make any sense to me at all. And we talk about this being fighter combat, but it really isn't fighter combat, because a dive bomber is not a fighter. A torpedo bomber is not a fighter. They are strike aircraft. And so it's really about strike, and the fighters are really there, more or less, to prevent the bad guy's strike from getting through and to enable the good guy's strike to get through. And which is not to say that you didn't have people when they did carrier raids against truck or something like that, going and strafing the ships with their 50 cals, especially against something like a destroyer. You could actually do some damage that way. But you're not going to sink a battleship or an aircraft carrier by shooting it with 50 cals. And that's even before you get into the fact that fighters usually only carry between 20 and 30 seconds worth of ammunition. So this idea that I'm just going to, hold the trigger down and just continuously fire, yeah, that's not really what they did. They tried to avoid doing that. So, thoughts?
With the modern battleships, bombs really could not deliver crippling damage. They could not get through the deck armor.
Yeah.
So what we turned our dive bombers into was flak suppression. Instead of trying to penetrate the armor, we went with general purpose bombs that went off on contact, and we tried to wipe out AAA crews to make it easier for the torpedo bombers to get in and really do the work.
And the Japanese had that as a strategy early on. That was part of their doctrine early on. And they kind of shifted to, at least in terms of, against carriers, they kind of shifted to if I can put a bomb on it, why not just put a bomb through the flight deck? And moved away from this idea of they had, like, I want to say they had special anti-personnel bombs that they were dropping. I can't remember where I read that.
Some frag bombs, yeah.
Yeah, and that's kind of crazy. Now, is that actually a swordfish there?
No.
Yeah, I didn't think it was. What is it? Do you know? I guess it's French, right?
No, I can't tell really for sure. It doesn't look like a short. It might be a Royal Air Force short because they did the first real work with torpedo bombers.
So I remember reading somewhere that the most successful torpedo bomber of World War II was the Swordfish. Most of the time, the Swordfish was, I think, not going after targets that were shooting back.
Yeah.
So they sunk an awful lot of shipping with the Swordfish. And, they sunk some warships, but it was a fine airplane. It was a little on the obsolete side, but it got the job done, and apparently it carried an awful lot. So impressive for what it did. Okay, back to scouting here. So I put this chart up because, as it turns out, it totally and completely makes sense that if you can attack at 300 nautical miles, that's because you can scout at 300 nautical miles for an aircraft carrier, right? More or less, right? It's also the case that, height of the target, height of your ship, et cetera, you can kind of think more or less of the visual detection range of a battleship as being about 24 miles, right? Does that make sense to you, Chris?
That on 100% visibility against a big ship, it's about there. Radar horizon's about 48,000 yards. So
yeah. So that's about what it's at. And incidentally, that's also about the speed. That's also about for the mechanism that you're using to do your scouting, either a battleship itself or an airplane coming off of an aircraft carrier. That is more or less 1 hour's worth of movement, right? 24 knots is not the maximum that a battleship can go, but more or less, that's a sort of a good rule of thumb. You could do worse than that, especially if you think that you need to zigzag a little bit because there might be a submarine around.
And most battleships could do 25.
Yeah, most can do 25, and some can do 30 or 32. But, more or less, it's about as far away as they could see is about what it would take them an hour to get to. Same is true with the carrier, right? It can scout out the airplane can scout out to about 300 nautical miles. It can attack out to about 300 nautical miles. It takes about an hour to get out to about 300 nautical miles, more or less, right? My point is not to get into the weeds on exactly what the speed of all these planes are, because I haven't talked about a specific class of ship. I haven't talked about a specific type of airplane. But it's just when you're sort of thinking about how long does it take them to do X, the answer is about an hour for something like this. So it takes an hour for these things to kind of develop. So I've always found it interesting that if a battleship shoots its guns at maximum range, it takes about an hour to get to where the shell is splashed. I mean, that sort of gives you an idea about, the difference in influence there. So I kind of think the best way to try to think about this is in terms of basically range of action, range of influence. It's like, how far can it reach out to do something? Airplanes end up moving about 10 times faster than ships. Like a strike package ends up moving about 10 times faster than ships, more or less. Airplanes can see a lot farther from altitude than ships can from the surface. They've got pretty wide swath. And so if you're dealing with something that like is a group of big ships, there's a good chance that you can spot it. Now, of course, there's cloud decks, there's haze, There's the fact that you've only got a limited number of eyes in the cockpit or, on the airplane to do stuff. If you're a single pilot, a single crewman plane, you've got a lot of stuff to do. Some of which is inside the cockpit, some of which is outside the cockpit, and so you're kind of busy.
Don't forget about grazing angle, though. The further away they are, the less you can see the wake, which is what you're detecting, not the hulls.
Yeah, you're detecting
the contrast of the wake with the water. So from higher altitude, you're, assuming no clouds, you're not seeing a whole lot further away. But as you point out, your search sweep rate is much, much higher.
Yeah, and if you really want to figure out the exact area that a carrier can search, you need to think in terms of sweep width and how many airplanes you need to devote to the task. And do I have queuing? Because they generally didn't do 360-degree searches, right? If nothing else, they assumed that the bad guys weren't behind them. And so they sort of limited it to a portion of the 360-degree circle. That's where they made some sort of default assumptions, and that's where they concentrated their search. So I don't think that I just gave you all a tutorial on search theory, because I did not.
Yeah, that's a very in-depth topic. Do you do double pass, two aircraft searching out the same body of water? Because probability of detection is not 100%.
And there's all sorts of interesting stuff. And this is actually covered in the Celander book, where he talks about, you really kind of wanted to have a high-speed aircraft to do this sort of stuff. A lot of searching in the war was done. Now, I'm really talking about organic searching. I'm talking about searching that's coming from the carrier. I'm not talking about PBYs. PBYs are famously slow. And but we did a lot of searching with them because you needed something like a PBY to get the range to sort of do strategic searching. I'll call it strategic searching. And there was a joke that Celander talks about. The joke amongst the people that did these sorts of searching was that the radio call was enemy fleet sighted, notified next of kin. Because there was a good chance that if they saw you, they were going to come and try to shoot you down in the hopes of getting you before you radioed back, or just because they were pissed at you because they got spotted. That's really kind of not what I'm talking about. I'm really talking about stuff that's coming off the carrier, and the question about how you go and do that. And, do you arm those guys or not? There was a big debate about whether do you have them just go and report and then you send a strike, or do you have dive bombers just go and conduct an attack if they see them? Well, there's a good argument to be made for both of those cases. So it's also worth pointing out that carrier combat can be what I call non-reciprocal. You can be under attack from airplanes that you know came from an aircraft carrier that's within about 200 to 300 nautical miles, and you have no idea where that carrier is, right? He knows where you are, and he's shooting at you, and you don't know where he is. And I'm having a hard time thinking of anything before that in the history of combat that was like that. You could get ambushed, right? But as a general rule, you got ambushed and you went, okay, they're shooting at me from over there. I didn't know that they were there. I may not know how many of them, but I know that they're over there. You can be under attack and you have no idea where those airplanes are coming from, which is kind of a weird thing, right? So, as I said previously, if aircraft carriers had to search like battleships by, sort of like using the radar on the ship or using their eyes, they would have no utility over battleships. You'd be better off with a battleship. It's the fact that they can search at range and influence, and as a result launch the strike at range, but it all comes down to that search portion of it, the scouting portion of it, that makes it work. And so I just think it's the scouting part of aircraft carriers that is really where the magic is, more so than the strike at range part of it. Which is not to say that they're not related. So obviously, because they're both using airplanes, frequently the same airplanes.
Now, recall, Germans tried to do this in World War I quite a bit, but they were using Zeppelins.
Yeah.
And Jutland would have been a lot different if the Zeppelins could have seen the British sortying or seeing them coming. But with the cloud cover, they could not.
They could not. And of course, the Brits had room 40. So the Brits, it was frequently the case that when the Brits would go to intercept the Germans, the Brits would go to sea before the Germans would, because they knew they were coming.
Mm-hmm.
So Bob had a question about, or had a comment about aviation fuel. Yeah, with aircraft carriers are so damn thirsty. I mean, they just burn through fuel like there's no tomorrow. You're having to do an underway replenishment twice a week. Yeah,
in the 1990s, the Navy was having to fight to maintain nuclear carrier production. And the General Accounting Office did a very interesting study that showed that conventional carriers and nuclear carriers conducted unrep at about once every 3 days, because the problem was the air group. It had absolutely nothing to do with the reactor.
Yeah, the difference in the number of underway replenishments between an all nuclear surface group with an aircraft carrier and an all conventional surface group with an aircraft carrier was like one unrep a month or something small like that.
Oh,
because it's all about the airplanes.
Yeah.
And so, I like nuclear surface ships. I do. And you can make an argument as to why you want nuclear aircraft carriers, but it's not because it will make your supply problem go away. That's not the reason to do it. One of the reasons why you might want to do it is because it does mean that you can go faster for longer at the risk of leaving all your escorts behind, which occasionally we've done. I can think of a couple of instances off the top of my head where we basically said, we need the carrier there now. The escorts will catch up later. So, okay, so moving on. So let's talk about Star Trek a little bit, because this is a show that, at least in theory, talks about Star Trek. I would argue that fighter combat in Star Trek does not look like the real world. Now, you can make an argument they're not really fighters, they're really something else, and I think that's a very valid argument, but let's call them fighters for now. It doesn't look like the real world because in the real world, you didn't have aircraft carriers charging into battle with the strike. Because remember, the strike is moving at 10 times the speed of the aircraft carrier. But in Starfleet, in Star Trek, you see that all the time. The larger ships go and fight alongside the smaller ships. And they're moving at about the same speed. And so it's not really about speed. It's not about range, right? It's not like the small ships run out of fuel and that they have some sort of range advantage. It's not really about firepower because they don't have anything that really is a more powerful weapon than what the big ships have. There's no equivalent of like a fighter-borne torpedo. The big ships have more of that sort of stuff. It's not really about scouting because they're all going in together, and frequently the big ships are the ones that have the super powerful arrays, and it's Star Trek, so they're counting the fuzz on caterpillars at 3 light years. Most shots in Star Trek hit, right? Phasers never miss. Okay, yeah, they miss. They hit about 60%. What's the hit rate in a typical battleship engagement? 3%, 6%, something like that. It was between 3 and 6% at the beginning of the Dreadnought era. It was between 3 and 6% at the end of the Dreadnought era. Now the range had gotten longer, but in Star Trek, most shots hit. And so you're not doing, fighters aren't about like, well, they're small and nimble and they can't be hit and they're hard to deal with. And like, no, they're not. You're gonna be hitting them with phasers a lot, because that's just the way phasers work in this universe. It's also the case that Starfleet clearly hasn't embraced the carrier. If fighters were so damn good, why are they building ships that go in and sort of slug it out? Why aren't they just building fighters? I mean, that's kind of the way it happened in the real world, right? We came up with a better answer and we went with the better answer. We always, cost stuff notwithstanding, we always go with the better answer because it's, wait for it, better. So you don't see that in Star Trek. So I articulated this to Alec back in episode 158. I think that what we really see here is most of the time we see these smaller ships, it's during the Dominion War. And I think what we've got is Starfleet has some of these small ships for doing things like fighting the Maquis, et cetera. For a lot of things, you don't need a Galaxy class. And so they've got some designs around, they've got some capability there. They've got what Corbett would term the flotilla to go do flotilla type missions. And in the case of the Dominion War, they started using those. They needed the hulls and they started using those against the Dominion. More specifically, they started using them against the Cardassians because the Cardassians were a technologically inferior foe. And they could throw these ships into that battle and not have to write a whole bunch of, we regret to inform you letters to the next of kin, because the Cardassians just weren't that good. They had a powerful ally on their side, but and Starfleet was kind of desperate, so they were willing to take a little bit more risk than normal. But I don't see that as playing out the same way if they'd been fighting the Romulans, for instance.
You also don't see in those episodes with the Dominion War battles, you don't see where the fighters come from. They're deployed. They're already part and parcel of the formation. So did they just fly from the starbase like that? I can't believe they're warp capable, but
I think that in some ways they kind of seem to be more like corvettes. But I mean, I think when push comes to shove, the problem is that the writer's room just doesn't get it. I don't think they've fully thought it through. They're doing the fighters are cool thing, right? And okay, fighters are cool. I'm on board with that. But to me, they seem really problematic in something like this because on top of that, everything I've ever seen in Star Trek, going back to when I was 10 years old, seems to indicate that bigger ships are faster. Bigger ships have bigger engines and they're faster, and they have more powerful shields and they have more powerful weapons and they have more of them. And the sort of advantages that you see in a fighter craft in the real world do not seem to be things that are advantages in this world. So I look at it and go, I don't understand why these things even exist in this world, except perhaps they're good at fighting pirates, right? They exist in this world for the same reason they exist in Traveler, in that they're not intended to go against capital ships. They're intended to go do this other suite of missions for which they are well designed. And then the writer's room didn't read the doctrine and they just sort of threw them into these battles.
And as we talked about earlier, part of this morphing of fighters as valid really is Starfleet battles.
Yes. That's a very good point that I didn't include on the slide, but
where your opponents, like the Klingons, they're not firing photon torpedoes. They're drone heavy.
Yeah.
So having fighters as a anti-drone force kind of sort of makes sense, because now the ship's phaser ones, if you will, are not trying to take out drones. The fighters can do that. You reserve your phaser ones for the D7 or the D6 that fired the drones.
So Starfleet Battles is wonderful from the standpoint that it's entirely sui generis, right? The tactics in that game are generated from the game.
Mm-hmm.
It's not generated by some designer saying, I think this is the way it should work. I mean, anybody who ever played the early editions of BattleTech, they give you these mechs in the game that the thing that you learn really, really quickly is nobody in their right mind would use those mechs. Shadowhawk and Phoenix Hawk, why would you, right? They're just not very good compared to what the other things available in the game were. But it's kind of what that's what the designers originally sort of thought was going to be the right idea. In Starfleet Battles, all the tactics are sort of generated from within the game itself. None of them are trying to be externally imposed upon the game. The downside of Starfleet Battles is it's only vaguely related to Star Trek. It's a lot less like Star Trek than it might at first appear. By the way, I totally forgot to mention this at the beginning. Pat Doyle says, hi, everybody. I had dinner with him not too long ago. Not this last week, but the week before. And I think it was the week before. It all runs together. He was in town because he was flying his Skybus, and he got to Salt Lake City, I think it was Salt Lake City. And plan A, when he left Minneapolis to go to Salt Lake City, he was supposed to spend the night in Seattle. He got to Salt Lake City and they said, congratulations, you're going to fly back and go to Washington, D.C. and spend the night in Washington, D.C. And so I got a chance to have dinner with him. So he says hi. Let's see, anything else on Star Trek?
No.
All right. Let's do Battlestar Galactica. This is, I think, the last slide, if I remember correctly, and then I'll go through and look at the comments, etc. So superficially, the Ronald Moore version of Battlestar Galactica, I think superficially it looks kind of similar to what we see in some of the Star Trek. You've got fighters fighting alongside capital ships. And so you might think the question that you should be asking there is like, why does it make sense in this universe to have fighters fighting alongside capital ships when it doesn't make sense in the Star Trek universe? And I would say it's because it's not the same universe. It makes I think it makes sense in the Ronald Moore universe based upon how I think colonial fleet doctrine is set up. Now, I will note, at no point in the show do they say this. They seem to do things that indicate that this was the case, but I could be totally wrong. But I can tell a coherent story about Battlestar Galactica. I cannot tell a coherent story about what I see on the screen in Star Trek. So a Battlestar is clearly a hybrid warship. It's got big guns. It's clearly a battleship equivalent, but it's also a carrier, and it's huge, and it's got a lot of armor, and it's clearly intended to be in the thick of things. That doesn't make sense in the real world, but it does seem to make sense in this universe. And I think the reason why is because of the jump drive. The jump drive is tactically useful. It gives them a high degree of precision. It's relatively quick to use. You can do it right next to a gravity well. It is the thing that lets them sort of get around, and they can use it with very few limitations. So it seems to be the case, we see it happen a couple of times, that the doctrine says the Battlestar jumps directly into combat, or at least it can. It dumps out all of its fighters. They go off and do whatever they're going to do. The Battlestar is doing whatever it's going to do. Some of it's offensive, some of it's defensive. It might be the fighters are like, keep small things with ship-killing weapons away from me while my big guns pound the enemy. Something like that. And then at the end, the Battlestar retrieves the air wing and jumps away. And the Galactica seems to be optimized for this. We see it's got this tactically precise jump drive. It can launch, it can basically flush out the entire air wing at once. And it can basically recover the entire air wing at once. We see that in the miniseries where they do a combat landing and they've got a fairly big opening that's pretty high, and they're coming in at multiple levels in through the opening. It's clear they're trying to get as many ships back on board as fast as they can. And I think that's just kind of, that was their doctrine that said you did it that way, and then you jump away. And so I don't have a problem with fighters and the fighters and the carriers all being part of the same battle, because I think in this universe, everything I've seen indicates that that makes sense in that universe. That model holds together far better than the Star Trek model does, I think. Thoughts on that, Chris? Am I making sense?
It makes more sense, but again, the Viper's not taking out a base star. They're not carrying missiles.
I'm not convinced that so first of all, the Galactica didn't have missiles. And so I think we maybe see Vipers with missiles at some point. They just don't normally have it. They did have other strikers that had missiles that the Galactica didn't have, but after they get together with the Pegasus, all of a sudden you start seeing the Raptors armed with missile pods. And so maybe the Raptors are sort of the ones that are doing that particular job. And you do see Cylon Raiders with missiles. So I could see it being the case that the answer is the purpose of the Vipers is to keep the Cylon Raiders off the Galactica or off the Battlestar while the Battlestar is pounding the enemy base star. Because the enemy base stars don't seem to have a whole lot of weapons on them, right? It's sort of like we're seeing two different doctrines. We got one, the colonial doctrine is fighters are defensive, and usually, and the Battlestar is offensive. And the Cylon doctrine is that the base star is just a truck, and the Raiders do everything. And so in that regard, that's sort of like they're using World War II carrier doctrine, but the colonials aren't.
Yeah. Now, the big advantage in Battlestar Galactica is the missiles are running around with nuclear warheads.
Yes. Yeah.
So if you hit a ship, I don't care how big it is, it felt it.
Yeah. Oh, and it's also worth pointing out the Raiders have a jump drive. The Vipers do not. The Raptors do, but the Vipers do not. And the Raider jump drive is better than the Raptor jump drive. And so I can understand the colonials are sort of putting everything into this package. If they want to get a Viper force someplace, they have to load it onto something that can jump. Whereas the base star can just sort of poop these things out and they can go make the jump as they need to. Now, I previously did I don't remember exactly when it was, but I previously did something where I borrowed an idea from Andy Presby. He thinks Colonial 1 is the civilian equivalent of a military ship, and that military ship was designed to deploy from battle stars and carry small strike packages someplace. It was a portable jump drive to get small strike packages someplace. Or he at least hypothesizes that. And I haven't seen anything that negates that idea. So, all right, that was my last slide. Let me close this and let me go look at comments and see what we've got. Let's see. Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody. Starfleet is actually controlled by the floating head of Brian May. I did not know that. I'm not sure. That's got to be a reference to something, and I'm not sure what it is. Let's see. Let's see. We talked about that. A little bit of discussion about Andromeda. I'm a big fan of Andromeda. Bob points out building a carrier is much faster than building a battleship. That's true. So Stephen Ross says, I recall hearing of a battle where the Americans accidentally crossed a Japanese T because the Admiral put his flag on the San Francisco, the only cruiser in the task force without the new radar. That was the first Battle of Guadalcanal, right?
So it sounds like.
Yeah, so that was not our finest day. We had 2 admirals killed in the battle, and arguably one killed the other.
I would also point out the radar that we had at that time had a bad problem with not only side lobes, but back lobes. And you're too close to land. So they didn't perform as well as they should have. And by the second Battle of Guadalcanal, we actually had ships with the Sugar George radar, which was a whole lemon peel array. And it didn't have as many problems. It was a dedicated surface search, and it did better. And that really worked to our advantage.
Yeah. In that first battle, San Francisco shot Atlanta. Was it Atlanta? So Admiral Callahan was on board San Francisco. Admiral Norman Scott was on board Atlanta. And they're pretty sure it was a blue on blue.
Yeah.
One of the ways that they can tell it was a blue on blue is that shells frequently had different colored dye in them so that you could see the shell splashes. And you could say like, oh, it's got green dye. That's my ship's shell splashes. So you could differentiate. And they found green dye, which was the San Francisco colors. They found green dye. Now, it's also interesting that battle is referenced in Starship Troopers.
Yeah.
Specifically in the scene where Juan Rico is in the office with the assassin and the third cadet whose name I can't remember, and they're talking about a situation where a junior officer gave orders as if he was the admiral because his command staff had been killed above him. That junior officer was Bruce McCandless, the father of the astronaut Bruce McCandless and the son of, I believe, an admiral, if I remember correctly. Bruce McCandless was the astronaut. Like he had the big free floating pack that they took up on the space shuttle. So when you see the thing where he's got the big backpack and the big thing, that's Bruce McCandless the third, I think, or maybe it's junior. I can't remember, but that his father was a lieutenant commander. And he just basically took over and sent signals as if he was the admiral. And after the battle, when they pointed out to him that like there's other people senior to you, his response was, they don't know the plan. And switching horses in the middle of a battle is bad practice. And so he knew the plan. And so he executed the plan. And if I remember correctly, he also was not the most senior officer on board that ship. The most senior officer was Lieutenant Commander Schoenland, who was the damage control officer. And he turned it over to McCandless and said, I'm going to be really busy keeping this ship from sinking. Why don't you command the ship? And that's why the damage control school in Newport was named after Schoenland. So I've been in Schoenland Hall.
To answer Randall's comment here, you're correct. But the Sugar Charlie radar did both functions. It could do surface search, not well, but it could do it. It was designed as predominantly an air search radar. And that's why we had problems with land so close, is the radars were jammed. Also realize these guys didn't have planned position indicators. They did not have PPI displays. They had B displays, which means as the radar went through a bearing, you had a little, jump on the oscilloscope.
So PPI is the thing that you think of when somebody says radar display.
Yeah.
Right? Where you're in the center and you got the sweep arm going around, that's a PPI display.
Yeah.
What they really had was a steerable oscilloscope.
That's really what they had. They had a bearing readout, and they could see as they were trolling through, and then they got a thing that could tell them the range.
Yeah, so big spike, it's close. A small spike, it's far away. It was the other way.
Something like that.
And so basically, they're mechanically steering the radar around, and when you get the big spike, you sort of read what the bearing is, and you figure out how big the spike is to give you the range. And they decided they could do better, and they did. So Stephen Ross made the comment, wouldn't it have made more sense to make your battleship able to resist fire, the most powerful gun you could mount on a battleship? That was constantly changing, and you're planning out years in advance. And the design work for the Montana started before the war, and for instance. And so as a result of that, you kind of had to be able to freeze the design. And the rule of thumb that we and the Brits used was we're mounting a big gun. It needs to be able to resist our gun at X number of yards. Now, that, like I said, rule of thumb, there are practical considerations that get in the way here, right? You had treaty limitations. You've got ship stability issues. You've got cost. And not all armor is created equal, and not all armor is installed equally. And so the Germans in particular did some clever things with how they angled armor, et cetera, and maximized the utility of some of their stuff. And, U.S. armor.
That wasn't the Germans.
Some of the German ships were known for that.
No, it's ours. South Dakota and Iowa had internally sloped in armor plates inside the outer hull, which could actually is a decapping layer. So mostly, if you look at the Bismarck and the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, they're flat. They're not angled much.
That's a good point.
Now you look at it from the Japanese perspective, because you said not all armor is the same, because it was the attachment points were bolted on, the holes were hand drilled.
Oh my God!
By people, which means they weren't face hardened.
Yeah,
it was non-Vickers, non-cemented armor. And so they went really, hugely thick plates.
So what Chris is talking about there is not all steel is created equal. And what you really, really want, you want really, really hard, really, really rigid, really, really flexible steel. If that sounds like it's an oxymoron, it's because it is. I just basically gave you two sets of criteria that are directly opposite each other. So how do you deal with that? Different time periods, it's been dealt with different ways. Sometimes, back in the old days, you dealt with it by having wrought iron on one side and like oak behind it to sort of give you some flexibility there. Then we started doing things like Krupp armor, Harvey armor and Krupp armor. And some of that was welding together two different kinds of steel so that you could have the properties of both. And some of it was how you went about cooling the steel so that the front of the plate and the back of the plate had different properties. Yeah. And Chris knows way more than armor than I do.
Well, the only reason why I know what I know is because I've benefited from a lot of work done by a guy by the name of Nathan Oken.
Yes.
And he did a number of articles in Warship International. Now, that one where you have two different kinds of steel and you put them together, that's compound armor.
Yeah.
Where you have,
I thought Harvey armor, didn't Harvey weld two plates together?
Nope. He did the initial type of cementing process.
Okay.
Krupp had a better process.
Yeah. And so usually when they're comparing armor, it's translated into an equivalent.
Usually of Krupp cemented armor.
So you'll see something that says like, it's the equivalent of 5 inches of X.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why you do that is because otherwise, you're comparing apples and oranges. And I remember reading somewhere not too long ago that that U.S. armor was essentially just as good in World War II as it was in World War I.
Actually, it was better.
Yeah,
and it also depends on the thickness. Our cruiser armor was better than anybody else's.
Well, the comment was that the Brits eventually decided that the Brits had some pretty substantial improvements in the quality of their armor, way more than we did.
Oh yeah, they had the best battleship armor.
Yeah, and that we thought we had the best battleship armor, and they knew that we didn't. That they knew that theirs was better. And I can't remember how they found that out, but they figured out that maybe they got an idea about what the process was. But the Brits actually had really good stuff.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm sure Bethlehem Steel was trying to sell to everybody.
Yeah. Okay, so that's it for that question. I'm going through. Randall Wong says that he thought that torpedo bomber was a Sopwith cuckoo.
Yeah, it could have been a cuckoo.
1917. Let's see. Olive said PBYs are fun to watch. Someone brought one to Oshkosh that when he was there. She was there. PBYs are beautiful but ugly.
Okay.
I mean, they're interesting aircraft. They're certainly interesting. Let's see. Scrolling. Okay, interesting head cannon there. Okay, I could see that. I could potentially see that. It's probably a little more involved than what I would come up with. Yeah, Philip Banks points out that the Galactica took a nuke hit when most of the armor had been stripped away, although it wasn't clear to me that the armor was stripped away from that area. Galactica nukes were sort of weird in that regard. We do see one instance where a nuke detonates and it looks, big bright flash. It looks just like that. And then we see other instances where it doesn't seem to have effects like that. So I don't know what's going on there. Philip Banks also says, didn't we see base stars pummeling with a lot of missiles and direct attack? Come to think of it, I think maybe we did. I think maybe we did see that. I need to go back and rewatch it because I watched it when it first came out. I haven't watched it since then. I need to go back. So.
The best one is when you see the Pegasus die. That's the best example of that. Is that episode?
Yeah, and I'm still mad at Lee for sacrificing the good Battlestar, although. There's at least one YouTube video that excoriates him for that. I point out that was a Battlestar that had taken a lot of hits. And we don't really have a good idea about how good it was internally. We we know fresh out of the yard, the Pegasus was a better battle star than the Galactica was. Neither of those ships was fresh out of the yard. I do not understand what the material condition of those ships was at that point. So maybe he didn't give up the good star. Maybe he gave up the battle star that had the cracked cylinder head and the engine was going to seize up anytime now anyway. Yeah, Alyssa points out it's Battlestar Galactica, not Battlestar Pegasus. The real reason why they got rid of the second Battlestar was that they couldn't afford to have the set, because the sets that they needed for the Pegasus were big and took up a lot of space, and they just needed the space. And so they kind of decided that they needed to take the set down. And since they needed to take the set down, they needed to get rid of the Battlestar. So, all right. I think that that's it. I don't see any more questions. We've actually gone a little bit longer than I thought we were going to.
Which is always the case.
Well, I mean, we always go longer than the hour that the show theoretically is, but sometimes we go a little over an hour and sometimes we go a lot over an hour.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. It's always fun when your producer's laughing at you. So, but if you would have asked me, I would have said this was a 75-minute show, and it's been a 97-minute show. So, okay, we overshot a little bit, but so with that in mind, Chris, any last words, parting shots?
No, I thought it was
Comments?
Covered everything nicely.
Okay. It's frequently the case that I come back to topics because, as I've explained before, part of it is I'm constantly sort of running all this stuff through my head, and I'm constantly thinking new thoughts about it and getting new information and sort of thinking about how to sort of put it all together. And so that's one of the reasons why I revisit topics that I've talked about before. Frequently when I revisit a topic, it's like, okay, I spent 10 minutes talking about it once before. Now I'm going to spend an hour or 97 minutes talking about a topic in much greater depth. And the other thing is that I don't make the assumption that everybody has seen every episode. And I don't want to create a situation where it's like, I'm not going to cover that because I covered that in episode 35. So you should go back and watch episode 35, and you can't listen to the show. You can't watch the show unless you're totally caught up on all the episodes beforehand. I don't want to do that. And I get new questions each time. So it works out well. Once again, I am always in awe of the fact that this little show is continuing to go, and there's a group of people that decide they want to spend their Saturday evening listening to me and whoever's joining me talk about things like this. And so I very much appreciate that you guys have the interest in it, and I certainly intend to come back. Although not next week, I will be moving bookcases around. So the week after next. So thank you very much, everybody. See you again soon.